I had always been drawn to the wilderness. The feeling of solitude and the rawness of nature always appealed to me. So, when I had the opportunity to spend a summer in the remote wilderness of Canada, you bet that I jumped at the chance. I arrived at the base camp, a small tent city in the middle of nowhere. We were surrounded by thick forest and towering mountains. The air was crisp and fresh, and the only sounds was nature and the chirping of birds. It was a little slice of heaven. I was assigned to a team of 3 other researchers, all of whom were seasoned veterans of the wilderness. They knew exactly what to do, and I quickly learned from them. We spent our days trekking through the thick woods, mapping out the terrain, identifying wildlife, and even taking samples of the flora. The days were long and tiring, and by the time we retreated to our tents at night, we were simply exhausted. But there was something about the wilderness that just made it all worth it. The feeling of being so close to nature was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. One night, something changed. I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. Now, initially, I thought it was one of my teammates, but the footsteps were too heavy, too erratic. My heart began to race as fear truly set in. Now, I slowly unzipped the tent flap and peered outside. Now, what I saw both terrified me and left me in awe. It was a grizzly bear, standing just a few feet from my tent. It was massive, its fur matted and unkempt, and its eyes glowed in the moonlight. Its breath, too, was heavy and labored. I froze, as you can imagine, not sure what to do. I knew that grizzlies were incredibly dangerous and that provoking them was simply a recipe for disaster. I was certain that any sudden movements would put me in harm's way and alert it to my presence. I watched it, but it could have only been minutes. Now eventually, it wandered off and I was left alone once again. Now I was so startled from this that I was paranoid. I couldn't sleep and my mind was always on high alert. But that was just the beginning, because over the next few days, strange things began to happen. We would find animal carcasses that were ripped apart as if something had attacked them with extreme force. Our equipment would go missing, and our tents would be tampered with. We wrote it off as just bad luck or something easily explainable, possibly the work of mischievous wildlife. But I still at times could not shake the feeling that we were being watched by unseen eyes. And then one day, we stumbled upon a cavern in the mountainside. It was dark and damp. The air was thick with the smell of something rotting. We cautiously entered, not sure what to expect. Inside, we found bones scattered everywhere, as if something had been feasting on them. I knew then that we were not alone, that there was something out there, something dangerous and unpredictable, and I knew this was not a bear den. It just felt different. The smell was different. We decided to cut our trip short and packed up our gear to leave. As we made our way back, I couldn't help but feel continually hunted. I knew that we had to come face to face with something. As it turns out, my grandfather had a very similar thing happen to him while he was hunting in the same region nearly 40 years ago. Now, my grandfather had always been a very avid hunter, and he loved nothing more than spending weeks at a time in the remote wilderness. One day, while on a hunting trip with some close friends, they encountered something unexplainable. They had been tracking a herd of deer through the dense forest when they saw something moving in front of them. At first, they assumed it was a bear, but as it got closer, they realized it wasn't anything they had ever seen before. What they described was tall and slender, with matted fur and glowing eyes. It had a human-like face, but the body of an animal, and it moved with an unnatural grace. My grandfather and his friends were frozen, but also tried to shoot at it. The creature stopped, stared at them, The bullets seemed to do nothing, and then it let out an ear-piercing shriek, and my grandfather and his friends turned to run as soon as they realized the bullets were not doing anything. Fortunately, they made it back to camp safely, and that creature did not pursue them. They were extremely shaken. They reported it to some park rangers, but they were dismissed as just another group of hunters telling tall tales. Now, my grandfather knew he had seen something. He just wasn't sure what. He never forgot it, though. But after that, he stopped hunting for years, and even warned people away from going to this specific place in Canada. Now, even now, when I ask my grandfather about that story, he still acts a little spooked. I could see it in his face when he has to recount it. In the winter of 2019, I was driving back to my hometown of North Bay, Ontario from a working trip. The journey was long, exhausting, and lonely, as there were hardly any other cars on the road. My eyelids felt heavy, and I realized that I needed to focus on staying awake. After driving for hours on Highway 11, I decided to stop and stretch my legs. The time was around 3:30 in the morning, and the temperature was well below freezing. The landscape was pitch black, and the only real source of light came from the full moon up in the sky, which provided an eerie glow over the snow-covered ground. Now, after my brief break, I got back into my car and continued north. The heater on full blast, I tried to concentrate on the road for a while, all while fighting off sleep. Now, a few kilometers from South River, my eyes caught something strange up ahead. At first, I assumed it was a deer, as it stood about the same height and was standing quite still on the side of the road. So as I slowed down, I noticed that the creature's body was different from a deer. Its skin seemed to resemble a human's, appearing pale and almost translucent under the moonlight. Now, upon closer inspection, I saw that the creature was impossibly thin, its long limbs long and gangly. It stood on all fours, but the proportions seemed off. Its front legs resembled human arms, tipped with long, sharp claws instead of hooves. Even more unsettling were the creature's antlers. They were unusually large and twisted, with points sprouting off in seemingly random directions without any discernible pattern. My blood ran cold as I realized I might have stumbled upon a creature from local legends, the Windigo. Now, I'd heard tales about it around campfires growing up, but never would I imagine that I would witness one with my very own eyes. As I sat there, unable to even move or breathe, this Windigo began to slowly cross the road in my direction. It moved in an odd, jerky motion, as if each step it took caused it a tremendous amount of pain. Its black, matted fur-covered back looked nothing like the lush hide of a deer. It appeared coarse and mangy in some spots, even bald. I could see every muscle tremor as it dragged itself, as if carrying the weight of an unearthly hunger. Fear had gripped me and took hold of me, and all I wanted to do was to drive away and put as much distance between the creature and myself as humanly possible. But a part of me was also equally fascinated, and I found myself reaching for my phone to capture a picture. And of course, by the time my hand reached the device, the Windigo had vanished into the dense tree line right along the highway. So with a shaky hand, I put my car in drive and sped off. My heart raced for the remainder of the trip home, and I questioned whether what I saw was even real or just a figment of my overtired imagination. Now, that night, I did not sleep. Instead, I scoured the internet searching for any information about the Windigo, poring over other people's encounters with this creature, each story backed up by the gruesome details of what I'd witnessed. Now, upon arriving home the next day, I actually shared my experience with my family. And to my surprise, my grandfather, a man of very few words, listened intently. And he too shared a very similar story in which he had encountered a Wendigo in his youth as he traveled through the more remote regions of northern Ontario. Now, I can't say for certain that we had encountered the Wendigo, but it certainly wasn't human. It wasn't someone in a costume playing a prank, and it was definitely not a deer. All I know is I never want to see it again. I was only 5 when my family moved to a small, remote town in northern Ontario, Canada. Our house was surrounded by miles of dark forest, seemingly untouched for generations. Now, my mother and I loved taking walks in those same woods, often in the late afternoon or early evening, enjoying the serenity they offered. The trees stood tall like towers of history, providing a canopy that sheltered us from the outside world. We made it a tradition to embark on regular explorations, which we fondly referred to as our adventures. Now, things began rather calmly, even mundane by most standards. On sunny days, the sun would filter through the leaves, creating a beautiful tapestry of dappled light on the ground. We would occasionally come across wild berries, which we would pick and enjoy along the way. The forest had become somewhat of a sanctuary for us, a place that we can unwind and bond together. Now, one evening, as our walk had stretched further into dusk, the sky would gradually shift to a much more moody shade, with clouds rolling in and thunder rumbling in the distance. It appeared that a storm was brewing, so we made the call to head back home. And as we walked through the woods, the shadows lengthened and the air began to feel heavier. With each passing minute, the environment around us transformed from a sanctuary to an arena of unease. As we reached the edge of the woods, where our house rested atop a smaller hill, we heard a very unsettling noise coming from the direction of the underbrush. At first, we thought it was a wounded animal, a low guttural groan that sent shivers down our very spines. I turned around to look for the source of the noise, and my eyes widened in fear as I caught sight of a large, menacing being standing amidst the thick foliage. Its form was only partially visible in the dim light, but what I could see was enough to make my heart nearly beat out of its chest. Without wasting a moment, my mother scooped me up into her arms because she now sensed that this thing meant bad news, and she sprinted up the hill towards our house. The groaning then evolved into a heavy, raspy breathing, this being audibly keeping pace as if right on our necks. My eyes remained fixed on this figure, watching it as it very oddly galloped ever closer while my mother put every ounce of her strength into speeding up the hill. We finally made it to our home, bolting through the door and slamming it shut behind us. Now it was here that my mother had to take a moment to ensure I was unharmed before we both tried to catch our breath, hearts both pounding. The thunderstorm continued outside, a rather fitting backdrop for the sudden terror we had experienced. Now, in the years that followed, we would never venture into those same woods after dusk again, opting for the much-loved safety of daylight. But at night, I would often hear unsettling noises echoing through the darkness, strange screams and cries that defied all rational explanation. Even our old German shepherd exhibited a curious weariness near the clearing where we had spotted that figure before. She would often bark and growl, and her hackles would raise at the unseen, leaving us all on constant alert. Now, as I grew older, I found myself drawn to researching the supernatural, specifically paranormal phenomena, particularly skinwalkers and Wendigos, which, if you don't know, are powerful and malevolent supernatural entities primarily stemming from indigenous folklore. Now, what's interesting is their descriptions matched closely with the memories that I encountered, and I couldn't help but wonder if one of these creatures had been lurking behind us on that same night, that perhaps one of them was actually responsible. Now, fast forward years later, I now have a family of my own, and though we do live in a different part of Canada, I find myself continuously drawn back to the forest of my childhood. I still walk the trails, finding solace in the stillness of the woods during the day. But also, as it nears dusk, the memories of that encounter loom large, and I quickly make my way back home before anything could happen. Now, despite my mother's insistence that it had been a coyote, which I think she claimed that to protect my innocence, not a day goes by that I don't consider the possibility of a more sinister or supernatural explanation. The experience it's marked me, but it has also instilled in me a deep respect for Canada's vast and mysterious wilderness. Now, I may never know for certain what we encountered on that stormy evening. It's a story and experience that will forever be sealed into my persons, my very spirit, a testament to the untamed evil that could still haunt those forests after all these years. I mean, after all, many of the indigenous have stories that go back hundreds if not thousands of years of the same kind of entities. So, is it possible my mother and I encountered one of them? I'll let you be the judge. I am a wilderness guide who has spent my entire life in the most remote areas of Canada. Being one with nature is my way of life. Living in the wilderness seemed exciting and adventurous at first, but it has been quite a journey, full of challenges and unexpected turns. One particular event that took place outside Alberta changed my perception forever. At the time, I had been hired by a group of researchers to lead them into a very remote region of the Canadian wilderness, miles from any civilization. They were busy investigating a series of unexplained events and sightings that had been reported. My task was to ensure their safety and provide navigation as we ventured deep. Now, we started our journey early in the morning, making our way and crossing rivers. The first few days were relatively uneventful. We encountered nothing but the typical wildlife one would expect to find. All while setting up near a small lake, one of the researchers, whom we'll call Stephanie, discovered peculiar tracks near the water's edge. They appeared to be unlike any animal tracks any of us had ever seen before. Their shape was somewhat disturbingly humanoid, but the size and the spacing of the tracks indicated an unnaturally large and heavy animal. While as the days went by, our expedition progressively became more and more bothersome. We began to hear strange, unidentifiable noises at night, as distant howling and cries that none of us could properly identify. The researchers grew increasingly anxious, but we pressed on, determined to uncover the truth behind these mysterious events. But it wasn't until the 7th day that we had our first direct encounter with an unknown entity. We had just finished setting up camp for the evening when this ear-piercing scream broke the silence, causing everyone to freeze in their tracks. The scream had lasted for several seconds before fading away into the night. We quickly grabbed our flashlights and began to scan the perimeter. We found no trace of the source. Now, the following morning, we found Stephanie, who was on night watch, pale and shaken to the core. Her claim was that while everybody was sleeping, she had seen a dark figure moving quickly near the tree line, that it had faintly glowing eyes in the moonlight. At first, she thought it was one of us pulling a prank, but as she called out to it, the figure simply vanished into the darkness, not only confused but leaving her terrified. Now at this point, the entire team was on edge. Some of the researchers even began to discuss aborting the mission entirely and just returning to civilization. But our determination won, and we'd made the decision to press on for a few more days to see if we can gather any further evidence. Now 2 days later, we discovered an old, dilapidated, abandoned hunting cabin deep within the forest, seemingly untouched for what appeared to be decades. It was quiet inside, and a thick layer of dust and cobwebs covered nearly every surface. We explored a bit and stumbled upon a worn journal filled with hastily scribbled entries, all written by what seemed like the same person. Now there was an author, a person who was named Thomas, described similar experiences to our own, detailing his encounters with strange noises, unexplained tracks, and a glimpse of what he described as a mysterious creature. The only problem was his entry was dated 30 years ago, and the urgency and fear in his writing were palpable. He wrote of how he had decided to confront the creature, venturing deeper into the forest, armed only with his hunting rifle. The journal ended abruptly, leaving us to ponder his fate. By now, we knew we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding. Many of us suspected it might be a Wendigo, mythological creatures from indigenous legends known to haunt the wilds of North America. Regrettably, even now, we are still unsure of its true identity, but we chose to cut our journey short, deciding to return to the safety of civilization before any of us became the next unfortunate victim. After all, we really had no idea what kind of animal we were dealing with. We couldn't help but feel the weight of the unknown lurking just beyond our sight. Though we were never able to find concrete evidence, it has definitely left a lasting impression on all of us. A few years ago, when I was still in high school, I used to hang out with this peculiar friend of mine, Alex. He was a strange cat, but he was also always fascinated by the unknown. He would always talk my ear off about ghosts and demons and Bigfoots and things like skinwalkers. Others found it strange and dismissed his ramblings, but I was always drawn to his stories. Anyway, back then, I was really into horror, and his storytelling prowess made him the perfect companion, so we ended up hanging out a lot. We spent a lot of time together, actually, and we lived in the same neighborhood in a small town up in Canada, which allowed us to spend a lot of time together, especially during school breaks. Now, when Easter break arrived, we started spending most of our time at the local arcade, but after a few days, we were craving something different. That's when Alex suggested exploring the small forest south of our tiny town. It wasn't known for any ghosts or demons, but was pretty much ignored by everybody, except maybe the occasional park ranger or camper or hiker. We thought it would be exciting to roam around and share horror stories and maybe try to spook each other. I mean, who knows? Maybe we would get lucky and see a Bigfoot. So, we took a bus that stopped close to the forest and set off on our own adventure. We'd spent the first few hours or so walking around, telling stories and not expecting anything unusual to happen. We were just having a good time. Our little exploration turned a little bit different when we stumbled upon an old homestead, kind of sitting and nestled deep in the woods, but you can tell on some old abandoned property. It was sitting on a very large meadow. Now, it looked like at one point they had horses because of the old tool shed and barn out back, but that's just what I'm guessing. But there were some more bizarre things about the property. I mean, it was perplexing. We couldn't understand why anybody would have a house in such a remote location like this. I mean, whatever road led up to this property was vastly overgrown at this point, so it just kind of seemed abandoned and completely detached from any civilization. Everything was overgrown, lots of vegetation covering its exterior, the door was gone, and all the windows were shattered. So whoever was living in it at one point had now left. So anyway, my friend Alex urged me inside, and so I followed him without uttering a word. Once inside, the house looked exactly like you'd expect. Everything was gone, the windows were shattered, and it looked as if somebody hadn't been in there in years. Now, just as we were about to leave, we heard this eerie howl, unlike anything we had heard before. We were upstairs at the time, just looking around and chilling, and then this sound erupted. Instinctively, we knew something was wrong. Another howl confirmed that it wasn't just our imagination. Alex tried to quench my fears, suggesting it was probably a coyote, but I doubted his theory, considering we had been told that they were uncommon in the area due to extremely excessive hunting. But before we could further debate our situation, another howl pierced the silence, followed by something even more alarming. A voice. It was strangely discordant, though, with high and low pitches intertwined, as if someone or something was desperately attempting to mimic human speech. And then we heard it. We heard the voice talk. We couldn't make out what it was saying, but it reminded me of an old, staticky, distorted AM radio. We heard the voice. And I said, "Shh, Alex, do you hear that?" And it sounded like it was getting closer. I couldn't exactly make out what it was saying, but it didn't sound good. We were terrified, rooted to the spot. The voice spoke again in an even more bizarre tone and closer than before. It sounded so monotone, like somebody was trying to mimic our voices. We couldn't comprehend what it was now saying. And out of nowhere, a gunshot echoed through the forest, quickly by some yelling. The sound of a struggle outside and downstairs preceded the arrival of a couple Native American men who found us. He never disclosed what was lurking below. They only warned us that down there was something evil, and they advised us to leave immediately and never return. They never asked us our names, or why we were there, where we came from. But they told us over and over, "You guys should have never came here. It's going to find you. It's going to mark you. Go back to your homes now where it's safe." I'll never forget the sternness and seriousness of their tones and their faces. Now, that experience has bothered me for years and years to come. I mean, I still have nightmares about it. So, I don't know if we somehow stepped onto the property of a demon or some sort of devil worshiper or what it was. I mean, I'm glad that Alex and I never saw what it was that was making the noise, but God, I don't even want to imagine what it was. All I know is if it wasn't for those kind Native American men that saved us, who knows what would have happened. Because when we heard that noise outside, it or they or whoever they were clearly knew we were upstairs, and it was coming into the old building. Now, the last we had heard was that it was actually inside, near where the stairs were, and that's when all the noise erupted. Now, again, I don't know if it fled, I'm not sure. We didn't ask questions, we just took heed and got out of there. All I can say is we never returned back there, and Alex and I still hung out after that, but our deep woods adventures were much less moving forward. After high school, him and I lost contact, and, well, I haven't heard from him in a very long time. I'm sorry if my story's not all that exciting, but that's what happened.